friends, and welcome to Ariel's Twilight Years, how to be a really old model. I'm going to talk today about a subject that is very precious to me because it relates to something I used to be very frightened about as a model, and is something that I'm not very frightened about anymore. So I'm hoping that by sharing some of my knowledge I can make other models a little bit less scared of their futures. I'm on my finance sofa today, where I shot my How to Maximise Your Earnings as a Model video a couple of years ago and my How Much Does an Internet Model Earn video. But today I'm going to talk about retirement strategies for models. I'm going to talk about specifically the retirement strategy that I chose, which is property investment. I buy houses and flats and rent them out to residents, which makes me an income, which I hope will eventually be enough for me when I retire. I started modelling at the age of 25, and it felt as though almost immediately people started asking me what I was going to do when I retired. And at the time I thought that retirement for a model would be around the age of 30, based on what other people had told me. And I reached 30 and assumed I was in the end game, and now I'm 42 and I just had financially the most successful year of my career. So I think that a lot of models' fears about everything being over by the age of 25 or the age of 30 or the age of 35, a lot of our fears are unnecessary, but we have to acknowledge the possibility that we are in a somewhat front-loaded career. That although I'm in middle age and am making a good income now, probably by the time I'm 65, I won't be making as much money as I do now, whereas a lot of people in more traditional careers will be at their peak earning at retirement. So it has made me frightened throughout the first 10 years of my career about what I'm going to do next. How I'm going to possibly continue to make the sort of money that I've got used to as a model in any other field, given that I don't have formal qualifications, and a lot of the models in my acquaintance are in exactly the same situation. We might have A-levels, we might even have a degree, but we don't have a job that we could walk straight into at the age of 45 that would make us the same kind of income that modelling does. So, quite a frightening situation to find oneself in. And through most of my career, I've been quite anxious about money, because for the first 10 years of my career, I was earning between £40,000 and £50,000 a year. I might be earning okay now. That's going to stop at some point soon, and how am I going to ever be able to afford to retire? Well, as Russell Crowe so memorably said in Gladiator, what we do in our 30s and 40s echoes in retirement. I'm pretty sure that's what he said. I need to make a disclaimer before I get into the meat of this video. I have to admit to you, I am awful at maths. That should encourage you, because if I can do this, when I really struggle to read numbers, anything above a six-figure sum, I really find difficult to read. So if I can do this, you can probably do this as well. Another disclaimer is I'm making this as a simple introduction, bearing in mind that some people watching this video might be quite young models who've never bought their own house. This is not going to be a comprehensive guide into property investment. It's meant as a jumping off point. If you actually want to do this, you're going to have to do a whole lot more research on your own. And a final disclaimer, I would love to be able to claim that this strategy would work across the whole world. As it happens, my knowledge is specific to the UK. So when I was 29, I'd been modelling for about 3 years, I got enough money together to buy a flat. I was buying in London at quite a bad time to buy in London, really, because the property market was booming. And it was just before the credit crunch and recession, so the market was about to crash, although of course I didn't know that. I was buying a flat in London because London was where I lived and where I worked primarily as a model, so it made sense to me, even though it is the most expensive place in the country to buy. I was looking at property right at the bottom of the food chain. I got a small deposit together, and the maximum I could spend was £140,000 with a large mortgage. I managed to get a one-bedroom flat for that, and I lived in it for about a year. Then I met my now husband, and after dating for a while, we decided to buy a house together. By that time I'd saved up some more money, so I put that into a deposit for the house that we then lived in, and we've lived together ever since. At the time, it seemed like a very strange thing to keep my flat in London, but because I didn't know how well Howell and I were going to get on living together, I decided to keep it for a little while as insurance. And so I found a letting agent and I rented it out to someone very much like me. I ended up keeping that property, I still got it, so 13 years later, it has never been empty for more than half a day It's had a constant stream of tenants, and as time has gone on, the rent has gone up that I could charge, and the mortgage is well on the way to being paid off. And that was always my retirement plan. I thought that although it only makes me about £1,000 a month, and there are expenses to pay, like I have to pay my letting agent, I have to pay ground rent and service charges, and I have to pay tax on that money. I thought, well, it's the beginning of a pension. And I always thought in the back of my mind, I should probably do that again at some point. I should probably buy another property and see if I can make a similar return, because then it would be maybe enough to retire on. But of course, property values had gone up during that time, and it seemed like an insurmountable thing to do. But then I started doing some actual research. So in 2015, I bought a book called Property Investment for Beginners by Rob Dix. The link's in the notes below. And I realised that perhaps rather than buying one other property, I should buy multiple other properties and make myself a proper income for retirement. So that's what I commenced with doing. So this is what you need to do if you want to follow a very similar strategy to me. First of all, you need an income of around £30,000 a year or more, otherwise a mortgage lender is unlikely to lend to you. Ideally, you need to be attractive enough as an investor that multiple mortgage companies would be interested in lending to you, because it means then you can take advantage of better rates. So that's the first thing you need. The next thing you need is to be capable of saving money. Now, this I know is really hard for a lot of people, and it's one of the things that I have an advantage in, because I'm scared about numbers and as a result get worried about money. I've always been quite good at saving. I know a lot of people tend to live at the absolute limit of what they can afford, so they spend all their surplus income. But if you can save up, at a minimum, I would say, to do the sort of investing that I do, you probably need about £25,000. £20,000 as a deposit, and then £5,000 for solicitor fees and tax. My strategy at this point in my career, now that I've started earning more money, I save that much, £25,000 every year. So my strategy at the moment is to buy a property worth about £80,000 with a 25% deposit every year until I've reached my goal. To do that, I get a 75% mortgage with my 25% deposit, which is around £20,000. So I always go for interest-only mortgages, which I know sounds very, very scary, and I was really opposed to doing this when I first heard the argument behind doing it. The reason I do it is because it gives me flexibility. My intention is to pay off the mortgages on the properties that I buy, but having an interest-only mortgage means that you get to choose when you do it. So I save money by not having to commit to repaying part of the mortgage every month. And with that money I'm saving, I can put it aside to hopefully pay off mortgages later, maybe if the interest rate goes up and I start to feel uncomfortable with the amount I'm paying every month. Depending on where you live in the country, you may think that £80,000 to buy a property is nowhere near enough. Actually, in many places it is. You won't be able to buy anything in London, and you'll probably have to avoid the prestigious places like Bristol or Bath or Brighton or Oxford or Cambridge. But there are many areas in the country where £80,000 actually goes a fairly long way. So if you can save your £20,000 as a deposit, you are very likely to be able to get yourself a reasonable property. I go for 2-bedroom flats and houses primarily, and I've not found it hard to find them at that kind of price. In fact, some of them are cheaper. The thing that you need to look into though, because if you have a look on Rightmove, you'll see a lot of very cheap property in some areas. So what you need to do is research what the rental market is like there. First, you need lots of people who are actually wanting to live in that place. So if it's a ghost town with no jobs, there's no point buying a cheap property there because it probably won't get rented out very successfully. The other thing you need to do is look at what average rental is like. So what I try to do with my little £80,000 properties is I'm trying to find places where I will get £500 plus rent every month. In some places, like Welshpool where I live, it would be hard to get that for the sort of property that I buy. In other places, like Telford, which is only 45 minutes away from me, I can easily get that kind of yield back. And there are many other areas in the country where it's possible to do that. What you want to be doing probably is looking for places that aren't immensely prestigious to live in, but are places with lots of decent fundamentals like good transport links, good town centres, lots of shops, lots of restaurants, and crucially, lots of jobs. And if you can find a place like that, you'll find that the rental market is likely to be pretty buoyant and you shouldn't have any trouble attracting tenants. So in summary, I'm looking for properties that I can buy for around £80,000, maybe up to £100,000, and I'm looking for rent that will be £500 plus per month. This is actually quite a conservative strategy. I'm quite risk averse and I'm not terribly ambitious about finding cheap properties that need a lot of work done to them and adding a lot of value that way and then trying to get the most high-end tenants who are happy to pay a premium. That's just not what I'm interested in doing because I've got very limited time because of my career as a model. It's possible to make a lot more money than I do if you're prepared to put a lot more time and effort into it, and at this point in my career I'm just not. So please be aware that what I'm talking about is a very conservative strategy. Even so, I'm making it work for me. Now, a word of warning about mortgages. You need to be aware that interest rates go up. At the moment, we are in a period of unprecedentedly low interest rates, which means that, for example, my mortgage on an £80,000 property will be around £160 a month. It's not very much at all, but that could go way up if interest rates start to rise. Fortunately, lenders these days are very risk averse themselves, so they tend to stress test your deal for you and they will not lend on something that they think you're going to get into trouble with if interest rates rise, which is great, but you should also check your own sums as well. As I said before, that's the sort of thing I very much struggle with, but it's perfectly possible to do with the aid of a spreadsheet. Hooray! When I talk about being a property investor, especially to people who haven't done it themselves, they often get quite worried about interest rates rising and they often like to warn me about it. But what they often don't take into account is that rents rise with inflation. So my London flat, for example, when I started renting it out, I was getting £700 a month for it. Now I get £1,000 a month for it because of inflation. And the mortgage payments have stayed the same. So the proportion of the rent that goes on my mortgage payment has decreased over time. Now, obviously, it won't do that in the short term. You'll only see that effect in the longer term, like a decade plus. But it's worth remembering that you will have that in your favour, even though interest rates could well and will rise. Now, property prices do crash, as probably most of us are aware. They tend to do that on a roughly 18-year cycle. So you'll have a massive crash, which we had in like 2007, 2008, and then prices will gradually start to rise again. We'll probably hit a phase where everything's booming and people are making a lot of money quickly in property, and then we'll probably have another crash. At the moment, according to most analysts, we're kind of halfway through the cycle, so it's probably not imminent, but obviously anything can happen. So for me, property seems best and least risky if you use a buy and hold strategy. If you're trying to buy stuff and get rich quickly, you need to be a lot smarter with numbers than I am. The other thing that people tend to say to me when I mention investing in property is, oh my goodness, property values might crash. And that's absolutely true. But actually, because I bought my first flat in a boom and it did crash, I am less frightened than a lot of people about it because I had no intention of selling my flat. So I bought it at £140,000 in 2006, I think, and it probably lost value in around 2008. But I wasn't selling it. It was just sitting there with tenants paying the rent, and now it's worth £250,000. So in the 13-ish years that I've had it, it's getting on for doubling in value. So the fact that there was a crash in the middle of that, it actually doesn't matter to me at all. And so I think you do need to, when you buy property, consider keeping it for the long term, because if you're prepared to buy and then hold on to that asset, the fluctuations of the market matter a lot less to you, especially since, thank God, rents don't follow the same boom and bust cycle. They drift a little, but they tend to drift up because in the UK at least, we have a housing shortage and we have a lot of land that we can't build on. So property is a safer investment, I believe, than it is in a lot of other countries. We're quite lucky in that in the UK. So having done my research, I formulated a new plan. Instead of trying to buy one more property and getting a meagre income for my retirement, I decided to buy a property at the rate of one a year at around the £80,000 mark, until I'd got around 8 properties, which would be making me a profit of around £2,000 a month. And when I'd got those 8 properties, I was going to start paying off the mortgages, which will raise the amount of profit I make as my mortgages get smaller and smaller and smaller, and so my mortgage repayments will shrink at the same time. So at the time of filming this, it's the beginning of 2020. I'm about to buy my 4th and 5th investment properties this year. Personally, I'm looking in Cardiff, and I'm looking to either buy 2 £80,000 properties or one £160,000 property, which will either rent out at £500-ish if I buy a cheap property, and £1,000-ish a month if I buy an expensive property at the top of my range, which is £160,000. So barring disasters in my modelling career, I should be able to buy my 6th property in 2021, my 7th property in 2022, and my 8th property in 2023. Whereupon I will hopefully still have a modelling career and I can start paying those mortgages off. I've got a strategy for if I can't afford to pay those mortgages off. At that point, what I will do is I will look at the property I've acquired that's had the most capital growth, which would probably be my London flat, and I could sell that in order to pay off the sums on my other mortgages. So there are some complexities you need to look into, because sadly it's not quite as simple as earning more than £30,000 so you can get a mortgage, being able to save around £25,000 to get started. The complexities include tax. The UK tax system has become fairly punitive towards landlords. So you used to be able to claim your mortgage payments against tax, and that is no longer possible to do, or at least not to the same extent. This is a very complicated bit of tax law, so I won't go into it in detail. But what you need to do to avoid it is you need to become a limited company for your property investing. You don't need to become a limited company for your other business, but before you buy something, you need to form a limited company, which your accountant will be able to help you with. Because of the tax complications, you need an accountant for being a property investor. I really don't recommend trying to do this stuff for yourself unless you are absolutely bloody amazing with tax law, in which case, go ahead, well done you. Another complexity you need to consider is the issue of whether you buy freehold, which is something like a house, or a leasehold property, which would be more likely to be a flat. I own both, and there are advantages and disadvantages to both. So I, being risk averse, have bought leasehold quite often because it means that you only have responsibility for your flat. You don't have responsibility for the whole block. That's the freeholder's problem. So if the roof breaks, it's their problem to solve. And given that I'm a landlord who's often out of the country, it's really nice to know that the big things that could happen, like the building burning down, are not actually for me to solve. On the other hand, with a leasehold property, you don't have ultimate control over what happens to it. If you get a management company that are greedy, they might slap massive service charges onto you. For example, my London flat, the service charge is almost £2,000 a year, and that eliminates 2 months of my income every year. Whereas my other 2 flats have much, much smaller service charges, around £500 a year and around £200 a year for the other one, because there's less laid on. They don't have communal gardens, they're not on a private road, they're not in a big block, whereas my London flat is, and the expenses go up. So you do need to be a little bit aware of that although flats can be a really appealing option because they're often a little cheaper than freehold houses, you do have that expense to consider. Freehold houses, the advantages are that you have all the control in the world over them, but if the roof breaks, it's all on you. That brings me on to a third complexity, which is that there can be unexpected expenses. My Telford flat this year, the boiler broke and it cost me £1,500 to fix, and that is 3 months' rent. So if you are planning for property to be your only income source, you do need to have a contingency fund for when things go wrong, because they certainly will. It's a rare year when one of my properties doesn't need anything done to it, and there's always the possibility that no one will want to move in until something big like a new kitchen is put in. So there are ways to make more money faster through property investment than the way I have selected. But I've got another reason for making the choices that I do, and that's trying to do the right thing ethically. Landlords don't always have the most positive reputation. I see a lot of quite negative press coverage of landlords, and I know that governments tend to want to tax us quite highly because we're not a very popular group. We're seen, I guess, as quite privileged people buying more houses than we need. And obviously I am. I'm buying more properties than I need to live in. So I feel as though if this is what I'm going to do, and it is, I need to be a good landlord. And one of the main things I do to try to make sure I am a good landlord is I try to buy properties that I'd be happy to live in myself. That is how I ended up with a good investment with my London flat, because I was literally buying somewhere for me to live in. And I've tried to keep that in mind as I've continued to acquire property, because although I could make more money, for example, buying places to rent out as houses of multiple occupation, HMOs, I didn't enjoy living in an HMO when I was a student, and I don't really want to offer accommodation that I wouldn't enjoy living in myself. In another effort to try to be ethical, because I know I'm buying properties towards the bottom of the market, a lot of the people who'll be interested in those properties, other than investors, will be first-time buyers. And I know getting on the property ladder is a precious experience, and it's also quite hard, especially now that property prices are so high in so many places, and a lot of people in their 20s just can't afford to. So I just made a decision really early on in my property investment career that I would never bid against a owner-occupier. So if I'm interested in a property and someone else has made an offer, or it wants to make an offer, and they are going to live in it themselves, I just walk away from it, because I feel like their need is certainly greater than mine, and I can buy anywhere else in the country, but if they need to live in Cardiff, then they should have the property for sure. In order to do a good job of being a landlord, I always have good letting agents. You can do all of this stuff yourself, but to be compliant with regulations and to make sure you're providing a good service, I don't think you can afford to be away from home or away from the area where your property is much. My property is all over the country and I'm away from home a lot, so I definitely need to have a letting agent so that if the fridge starts leaking, it can be fixed the next day rather than when I get back from Australia. Most letting agents charge around 10%, and I think it's totally worth the price. The other great thing about them is they save you so much money because they tend to have good relationships with contractors. So if you need work done on the property, you can often get it at a fraction of the price you would get if you had to contact a plumber or another kind of tradesman yourself. So from that point of view, they've saved me a lot of money too. Another thing that I definitely recommend is rent guarantee insurance and legal cover for if you get a rogue tenant who stops paying their rent and needs to be evicted. It gives me a lot of peace of mind. And finally, but most importantly, I've just given you a very basic breakdown of what I do to hopefully ensure that at some point in the future, when I'm no longer modelling so much anymore, I will be able to gracefully retire and still earn enough money to live and enjoy myself. Pretty much everything I've just told you is stuff that I have picked up from my own research, and the lion's share of my research has been done by listening to a podcast called The Property Podcast, which is run by the guy who wrote the book, The Beginner's Guide to Property Investing, that I mentioned earlier. He also has a YouTube channel, which I'm going to link to in the notes below. So there are all these resources, and a lot of them are free. And the only reason I can do any of this is because of people like him with a proper analytical background and a really good head for numbers, being able to point me in the right direction. So for the love of God, do not take what I've said on its own and go and be a property investor. By all means be inspired, but please take comfort from the fact that even though I'm not good with numbers, I have managed to do this. And the reason I've been able to do it is because of people like Rob Dix and the Property Hub, who have given me all the tools and information that I need to get knowledgeable enough to be able to make some good decisions about my future. So I hope that was helpful. I hope you can make good decisions about your future too, because I know if you're a model watching this, I know how frightening it is, and I have been very vocal about how we shouldn't be scared of our careers ending prematurely, because unless we get injured, we are very likely to be able to continue earning as a model into middle age. But I know that it's scary being in a physical job, and I really hope that it will help other people to consider the possibility of investing in property, because Jesus, I cannot understand pensions. I mean, I've really tried, but I don't understand them at all. And property, thank God, just feels tangible enough that I can understand what I'm investing in because I can see it. So if you, like me, struggle with numbers, I hope that was reassuring. I have been lucky enough to find a career that I had a natural talent in as a model, but I have no natural talent in finance, and yet I'm making it work. So can you. So thank you for listening. And one final thing before I say goodbye. As soon as I mentioned on Twitter that I was going to make this video, people started telling me that property investment's a really bad idea. Please refrain from doing that in the comments. It's not a bad idea, it's a perfectly good idea, and I've been doing it for 13 years. Goodbye now, goodbye!